There you are. Hey, this is Ty Bruner, and welcome to The People We Meet. This is a show about ordinary people that have done and lived through extraordinary things. Thanks for being here, and let's get on with it. Welcome back to The People We Meet, where we share stories and the voices of everyday individuals who help us better understand the world that we live in. Now, today, we're diving into one of the most complex and misunderstood topics in the U.S. today, and that's immigration. And on The People We Meet, like I said in episode 1, every once in a while, we have to go out and we have to find somebody who knows where the bear shits in the buckwheat. And today, that is Sam Smith. He's an immigration attorney from Spokane, Washington. He came highly recommended, very knowledgeable, and I'm looking forward to diving into this. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I appreciate the time.
We got a lot to cover today, so figured we'd better start off somewhat hydrated. So today we decided we were just going to drink water, and I had a couple sips of it. It's nice and cold. That's some high quality H2O. We are going to explore some of the realities and controversies between about terms like illegals and undocumented, and the feasibility of proposed mass deportations, and even the constitutional debates around deporting children born here to undocumented parents. And this is about separating fact from fiction and shining a light on the human stories behind the headlines. Now, all of my guests, they all come from somewhere. And Sam, I'd like to know where you came from. Where were you born? Introduce us to Sam.
Yeah, so I grew up, I was born, I grew up in Vienna, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. I was the youngest of 3 kids, the only boy. My dad, an immigration attorney. My mom, predominantly stay at home, taking care of the kids. I lived there for the first 18 years of my life until I went to Seattle Pacific University in Seattle for undergrad. Wanted to stay in Washington, going to law school. So then I ended up at Gonzaga and have stuck around in Spokane ever since.
That's so the family stayed home in Virginia?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, as of right now, my parents, they're splitting time between Virginia and Florida. My oldest sister's in Baltimore working in the mayor's office. And then my other sister is in Switzerland. This is relatively recent, working for the UN and State Department.
That's outstanding.
Yeah.
One sister?
2 sisters.
2 sisters.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to be an attorney?
Growing up, I worked with my dad, summers in high school, some in college, and I enjoyed it well enough. But my dad and I are also very similar. So, of course, we'd be butting heads a decent amount. And for a long time, I was like, I want to be nothing like him. I could not picture myself doing what he did. And then once I was getting towards the end of college and deciding what do I want to do, what's the next step, the only thing that really came to mind was doing pretty much exactly what my dad did. So that's, I think, a classic story. And so went to law school wanting to do immigration and just was lucky enough to get a job right out of law school doing that.
Nice. So growing up, close family? I know you said you butted heads with dad a little bit, but...
Yeah, I mean, nothing outside of the ordinary, I'd say. Really close. We still, get together on holidays and are FaceTiming, and we have my nephew out in Switzerland that we, are tracking from far on trying to get as much FaceTime as possible on the phone, unfortunately, but it's kind of what we got now.
Right. Little FaceTime.
Mm-hmm.
The WhatsApp.
The WhatsApp, the FaceTime, all that.
Well, your dad must be very proud of you.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful to have 2 parents that aren't shy about saying it.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
It's nice to hear that.
Yeah.
Like, did you play sports? What were your?
So I'm a lefty for some of the things, more full body things. I throw right, but I bat left, I kick left.
No kidding.
Unfortunately, I realized that was a natural advantage too late to take advantage of it. So I played football in high school, I played basketball, but the other sports like soccer, baseball, those sorts of things never really jived with me. But I still, even now, play actually indoor soccer and just like to stay active that way.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny that you said that because I write left-handed, I kick left-footed,
mm-hmm.
I throw right-handed, I bat right-handed, I'm a racquetball. I do everything else right-handed except for kicking right.
Interesting.
Yeah. And, and strangely enough, I went to a summer camp and they said, oh, you're left-handed? Well, then that's how you're going to hold a rifle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just because you're left-handed doesn't mean that you're left-eye dominant.
Yeah.
And till I figured out how that worked, I couldn't hit shit.
Yeah, I a little less extreme, I guess, but learning to golf, they just gave me righty clubs off, and I was terrible, absolutely terrible.
Everybody's terrible.
Yeah, which but then they're like, hey, why don't we just try some lefty clubs? And not to say I became Tiger Woods overnight, but I got way better. When turns out you use the right tools, it makes a difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that is amazing because as soon as I started shooting right-handed and used my right eye, it turns out I shot really well. Mm-hmm. So I still golf terribly, though. Yeah. Maybe I should switch. Maybe that's been the problem all this time. Mm-hmm. Seattle, what'd you get your bachelor's in?
Yeah, so I majored in history and economics.
Okay.
And leaving undergrad, there was a thought about potentially trying to get a PhD in history to try and teach, but ultimately law school won out for me.
Nice.
Yeah.
So Gonzaga was kind of a natural drift on over to the east side of the state?
Yeah. So my wife was originally from Spokane, and I think at the time we were engaged coming over here. That was honestly a negative. She didn't picture herself moving back to Spokane, but, which I feel like, also a classic story. A lot of people don't picture that or imagine that, but ultimately we wanted me to go to law school where I could get into as little debt as possible. And so Spokane is way cheaper to live in than Seattle, especially 10 years ago.
Sure enough.
And really happy with that decision. Yeah.
Good. You've accomplished quite a bit since then too. Tell me about the Manzanita House.
Yeah. So at this point, almost exactly 3 years ago, me and several other people who were working at a different immigrant-facing nonprofit in Spokane, we decided we wanted to do something different, start a new organization, and try to fill some of the gaps that we saw in the work that we were doing. And so with that, we met around the table that we're sitting around now, just to kind of talk about how we saw that. What does that look like? And of course, for me, it's a pretty easy vision. I'm an attorney. I do legal aid, and that's kind of where we started. We've definitely grown well beyond that. We do some cultural programming. So the heritage language classes, we work with the Arabic speaking, the Dari Farsi speaking, and the Spanish speaking communities to, teach those language to kids who either moved here when they were very young and don't have a strong language base there, or, were born here. It's language instruction, but it's also just like, hey, be proud of where you come from, and sure, love here, but don't be ashamed of your language or your culture. And we want to continue to build that up and do other community education and working with other service providers in the area as well.
And then tell me a little bit about the article that you wrote. I meant to delve into a little bit about this before we got rolling. The article in the Spokesman Review from 2019. Because I started reading it and then I couldn't read any further because I'm not a subscriber.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But it gave me the distinct, between that and the Manzanita House, I got the very distinct impression that your approach to immigration law was very humanitarian based.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So tell me what I missed in that article.
Yeah.
Tell me what I didn't get to read.
So around that time, just a couple months before then, I had the opportunity to go down to the southern border, and I was volunteering through my job with an organization called El Otro Lado, which is to the other side, and it's a binational organization that works in Mexico and the United States. And at that time, the first Trump administration, they had instituted metering, which was just severely limiting the number of people who could approach the U.S. border and ask for asylum. And so a lot of the work that we were doing there was meeting with people who were waiting for their appointment, oftentimes several months, in very difficult situations, but meeting with them and doing some general education about this is what asylum is in the United States, hearing their stories and kind of helping them be able to prepare to present themselves to the best of their abilities when they finally had their opportunity. That experience informed that op-ed entirely, and so, like you said, a kind of a humanitarian perspective, I think is really relevant. There's a lot of really good arguments from an economics perspective, from a demography and just population growth perspective as to why immigration is good. I don't love going to those first because at the core, I just view it as a humanity issue, a humanity perspective, and I understand that we're different nations, different populations, but at the same time, it's hard for me to divorce the interconnectedness of people all living on the same earth and understanding, especially being from the United States,
Absolutely.
our role in the world, both positive and I mean, I think historically oftentimes negative, that causes destabilization in some cases, and that can be a push factor for some people, but also our strong economy and a lot of freedoms that we have that are very strong pull factors for individuals. But ultimately, it's just recognizing that each person that was waiting there in Mexico for several months in very insecure conditions, not wanting to lose sight of their humanity and just the fact that they, according to our law, still, deserve the right to be able to say, hey, I fear returning to my home country. I would like to claim asylum and make my case. And I just saw the metering that the Trump administration was using at the time was, in my mind, antithetical to our law, but also putting people in really difficult situations that worsened their life. And so really wanting to write an article to say that, we have this role in the world. It's undeniable that the United States has a role in the world that I think has a lot of power behind it. And it's just really wanting our leaders to use that power and to use that role in ways that truly enrich the lives of, sure, our country, but the whole world, and kind of seek a mutual flourishing within that.
And I think it's important to remember that, the United States is nothing more than a giant melting pot anyway. We all came from somewhere.
And I think and I want to be really clear in this whole conversation, I think that a lot of damaging rhetoric was used in the Trump administration the first time. And, we're in the second week of President Trump's second administration. I think there's a lot of difficult rhetoric at the very least, and a lot of policies that I might personally disagree with. And but I also want to be clear that I think that our current immigration system is a failure across multiple decades of administrations on both sides of the aisle to not adapt. Not adapt our immigration law. The last major immigration policy change or statutory change was in the 90s. And at that time, the majority of the people crossing the southern border were single Mexican men who would cross for work, go back, and cross regularly. And it's been pretty clear since then that my migration patterns change. We've seen a lot more families, a lot more kids fleeing really unstable conditions, dangerous conditions. Some of them, of course, it's for economic reasons, but that's something that we've seen for decades at this point, and we have not done really anything to change our approach, which has kind of put us in a situation. And this is, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. Yeah.
Sure. So in my life, I try to be fair and balanced. And I feel like the best way to do that is to understand the issues. And so I tried to do my own due diligence and find out, okay, how is this supposed to work? How is this designed? And the analogy that I came up with, and I want you to correct me on this, add to it, or just tell me I'm completely wrong. I compared it to the freeway systems. So as I understand it, the immigration process was developed where people can cross the border and they have basically an appointment to begin their citizenship process. And in the meantime, they are given the allowance to come in and find a job and try to set down roots in anticipation of completing the immigration and naturalization process. And over the years, as like you just said, instead of single men coming over here that were workers, you had entire families coming up. And as the turmoil in not just Mexico, but pretty much every country south of the border has had, they talk about these mass caravans of people. And at first I didn't believe it, but then I started looking, it's like, okay, well, now I can see why, because so many of these countries are in some form of distress, disarray, whatever, that, it's like people are like, okay, I got to get out of here. I want to go to the United States. So I took that and compared it to the freeway system that was built in the 50s. And the freeways were developed to house the amount of traffic that were flowing through the roads at that time, which is no longer the case. Everybody has a car. We have multiple cars. And so the freeway system, people could say, oh, well, the freeway system doesn't work. It's because we never upgraded it from the original amount of traffic that was expected to flow there. Is that close? I definitely
think that's a workable analogy. I think There's a lot of decisions that were made, not just, in some ways, I feel like not just not upgrading, but in some ways, making it more difficult and downgrading the system that we have. And so I think it's certainly a good analogy. Just one example of that. So I mentioned a couple decades ago is 97, when the last major immigration reform happened in the statute and in the law. And that was under Clinton. They introduced these bars to returning to the United States if you had been in the United States without status. So if you were here for more than a year without status and you depart the United States, you would have 10 years that you could not come back to the United States. And so it used to be that you could have been here without status, and then, maybe you get married to a U.S. citizen, or you have a kid, or something happens. You could just go ahead.
When you say without status, there's different kinds of status, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so really it's you're here, either you overstayed a visa, whether that be a visitor visa, or you crossed the border without any contact with immigration and you never had any status to begin with. So if someone has a visa that's still valid, or they have a pending asylum case, they're not accruing this time that creates that bar. But if they violate their visa, so if you come on a visitor visa and you work, you're not supposed to, so you start accruing that unlawful presence.
If you go beyond that.
If you go beyond it, or, and so it used to be that if someone was in the United States and they had no permission to be here, they didn't have a visa, they didn't have residency, they get married to a U.S. citizen, they have a child who can petition for them, they could go back to their home country and process through an embassy and come back with residency. And there wasn't a particular bar. Now, essentially, if they're here, again, over a year without that status, without that permission, if they leave the United States, there's a 10-year bar to coming back. And so we made a system that is more difficult to fix the status of people who are in our communities, and if anything, incentivizes, once people are here, to not go back.
And hide out if necessary. But, okay. I didn't know about that. Well, there you can see where there's a hurdle, right? So that's still in place.
Yes.
Okay. So before we get too much further, I'd kind of like to start with some of the basics, and that's just some definitions, because I think without proper definitions, it invites confusion.
Yeah.
So explain to me the difference between terms like illegal and undocumented, and asylum seekers and DACA recipients. And then you mentioned refugees and asylees.
For sure. So starting with, undocumented and then illegal, I'd say when people are using those terms, generally they would be referring to the same group of people. It just depends on the lens that you're using. And so for me, my preferred term is undocumented. I think it's just, it's wanting to reduce the level of inhumanity. It feels if you refer to someone as an illegal, that it is denying some level of their humanity. From my perspective, we all have violated a law in the United States. We've all, done something that is not 100% above board. And so according to those standards, that would make all of us illegals in that way.
Okay. So to clarify, because I've had some fairly heated arguments with people that, so, okay, so when you're undocumented, that means you have no visa,
or you've overstayed a visa,
So, and I guess that's where I struggle a little bit, because if you are undocumented, you had a visa, the visa expired, and you are now illegal. And I also compare that to, the people that basically snuck over here. They jumped the wall, they swam the Rio, they crawled under the fence, whatever. To me, that's illegal. And, I don't mean it derogatorily, but I mean, if you came over here, if you snuck in, you're here illegally.
Yeah. And I think there's just the distinction between, an action that someone has done, and then also just kind of just painting them with that label, And so I think that's kind of the distinction, there, because it's not to say, especially people who have multiple entries or re-entry after deportation, that is against United States law. But again, it's just wanting to not, I just don't, for me, it's just, I don't see what we gain by labeling people in that way. Saying someone's undocumented, it still is communicating the same thing, to me, or very similar things, but it also, isn't, again, it feels like it is just reducing them to a particular thing, saying that they are like an illegal individual. It's a similar thing, which again, it's not incorrect according to all of our law. Someone who is a non-citizen, they are an alien, but I view that, and a lot of immigration practitioners view alien just as a very, othering word. And so it's not to say, according to the law, someone who's a non-citizen, they're an alien. But as you can tell, I've used the term non-citizen, to refer to those individuals just because it's one, not wanting to paint with a broad brush, but also, I just don't see what we gain by using language that, whether or not you mean it derogatorily. I know the people like that initial, the people that use it oftentimes do mean it derogatorily.
Right.
And it just doesn't feel like it is a step in the right direction to finding a solution to all this.
I would agree with that. And I think if you're going to use it, you need to know what you're talking about. For instance, I mean, what you just pointed out, if you come over here and you leave, you can't come back for 10 years. That really paints people into a corner, because if once again, using my analogy, when people first came over here, it didn't take that long to get that appointment, to go through that process. And like, if I remember what I read, it was somewhere around a year and a half. But now 5-6 years, people are waiting.
Yeah.
That visa is not going to expire over that period of time.
Yeah. And it's hard because when we're talking about this, there are some people who enter the United States and they have no feasible path to residency. If they have a fear of returning, they can claim asylum. They can say and we can talk about what that means, but
Sure.
They can claim that, or maybe you have a relative here who might be able to petition for you or apply for residency for you. But your ability to process here in the United States or process in your home country depends on your initial manner of entry. Whether did you enter with a visa? Were you inspected? Or did you enter without inspection? And then every case is so different. Then when we talk about, when we talk about the wait time for a case, or getting someone on the path to residency, on the path to citizenship, that looks so different depending on what type of case someone's applying for.
So how long is it? Is it typically a 1-year work visa?
So I guess when you say typical, what do you mean by that?
Okay, well, let me rephrase the question. What are the varying lengths of visas?
Yeah, so when we talk about visas, there's 2 types, and this might be getting too into the weeds. Feel free to cut this, but
no, because I don't think so. Because go ahead. Because if the visa expires, and you still haven't had your opportunity to pursue your path to citizenship, you're kind of in a jam.
Yeah, so there's 2 main types of visas. There's non-immigrant visas and there's immigrant visas. So if someone gets an immigrant visa, by and large, that means they have permanent residency. So like if I had a spouse, I'm a U.S. citizen, I have a spouse who's overseas, I apply for them, they have their interview at an embassy, they come to the United States on an immigrant visa, and that is essentially coming with residency. Then there's non-immigrant visas.
And that's because of you. That's because you're here.
That's because I am a U.S. citizen who is petitioning for my relative.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay.
Then there's non-immigrant visas, which the most common ones that we hear about are either going to be visitor visas or student visas. There's also a lot of employment-based visas, which just is a preface, that is not my general area of immigration law, so there's a murkiness for me there. But usually with those like student visa, visitor visas, they have attached to them, you must show that you have non-immigrant intent, that you intend to return back to your home country, and they are not permanent. So you talk about length of a visa, some of them are indefinitely renewable, even if they don't lead to permanent status. So for instance, a student visa, if you have a student visa and you enter the United States, you are admitted for a duration of status, which is essentially however long you are in school.
Gotcha.
It could be indefinite. If you wanted to keep being in school and at the same school. Visitor visas, the visas themselves are often good for 10 years, but when you enter the United States, usually you're only given a 6-month authorized stay, where then the government would expect you to return back to your home country within that 6 months. And so,
what is the 10-year part?
The 10-year, because it's valid for multiple entries.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you could leave and then come back a year later, 6 months later, and stay for another period of time. And so it's valid for 10 years, but each stay is set every time you enter.
So that's kind of the exception to you come over here and then if you go back, you can't.
Correct. Yeah. The thing that triggers that bar to returning, the 10 years, there's also a 3-year bar. There's various bars, is if you have status. So if someone is here for 6 years, but they have a student visa and they've been in their course of study the whole time, they haven't accrued any of that unlawful presence. They could leave, have no problem coming back with a different visa.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. So visitor visa, okay, copy. I got the visitor visa. I got the student visa as long as they're students. And then what about the work visa?
Yeah, so some work visas are temporary. We hear a lot about H-1Bs, and those, again, are just for a set period of time, and those could be, and like I said, this is where the murkiness comes in, but it's, usually a year, 2 years, a set period of time, and then they have to be renewed.
Okay.
But they can be, but there's also caps. There's a visa caps on a lot of those where there's only a certain number that can be granted per year.
So, and maybe you don't, like I said, I guess I have a few questions about this, but you said this was kind of a murky area for you. So I'm guessing there's like farmhand visa, like, an employment visa would cover people that come to work on a farm, but I would also guess that it would cover people that were hired to work specific projects. And that project is projected to take this long.
Yeah, so pretty much every employment-based visa is going to be tied to a specific job, either a specific employer or, a particular role with an employer. And in order to either change employers or even for some of them, even change the role that you're doing or the specific job that you're doing, require you to file for either change a visa or to file for a whole new visa. And so that's true. Like you said, there's some visas it's for farm workers, and but they're like stuck with that farm, with that farmer, that employer.
Yep.
And would need to, if they want to change, then they would need to have another employer who is petitioning for them. Not all of them. A lot of work visas require, same with a lot of all the family-based visas, require that there be someone in the United States who is petitioning for you.
So I have a question about that. So it seems like, and I didn't even think, this is all new to me. So, this is just kind of shooting from the hip.
Yeah.
But you come over here on a work visa and you're basically tied to that one employer.
Yeah.
And if that, you're stuck there. So that seems like it could open up the opportunity for that employer to treat you like dog shit. And then you're stuck unless you go back.
Yeah. And I think that is where, that's just a reality for a lot of people. A lot of employers, great employers, they realize they have a need. And so they find someone in the world who can fit that need. And that's great, and maybe they're working towards trying to get an immigrant visa where they can actually get residency and then they have more freedom. Unfortunately, we do see that. We see that with people who have no status, but also with these employment-based visas that are stuck with particular employers. And thankfully, there are certain humanitarian protections. So if some sort of labor violation occurs and it's severe enough, there's a potential to be able to apply for residency eventually, either on the basis of been trafficked. There's something called a T visa, or for victims of serious crimes, which can include fraud in foreign labor contracting, called a U visa. And so there are possibilities even outside of the immigration context. Just if someone who's listening to this is in a situation with a really difficult employer who's treating them unfairly or not according to what they agreed. Where we are right now in Washington, labor and industries is a very good tool and friend in helping to be able to recover lost wages or just protect rights. And just because we're talking about this, I do like to be very clear that regardless of status, even if someone is entirely undocumented, never had a visa, you have rights as a person in the United States and as a worker that, then there are protections that you can seek.
So that makes me think of more questions. So what about pay? Because say the job is in Texas, you're going to go, do whatever. The job's going to take 6 months. What kind of pay is somebody that's over here working on a work visa entitled to? Because in the state of Texas, I think the minimum wage is like $7.40 or $7.50 or something like that.
Yeah.
What are immigrant or migrant workers looking at?
Yeah. So, if you are here on a visa, then you're supposed to be paid market rate. There's requirements around that, because they're not wanting, the immigration system doesn't want you to recruit people, let them get a visa to specifically undercut U.S. labor. Where we see a lot, and like you said, when you're trapped with a particular employer, we see that happens. Underpayment and difficult circumstances occur, but also we see that a lot with undocumented individuals who have no status and oftentimes feel like they have no recourse, no ability to protect themselves. That's where we see a lot of like the severe underpayment, or sometimes just completely cheating someone out of pay because they are threatened with immigration enforcement or just generally threatened with physical violence sometimes. And so that can happen.
So it's expected that if the employer's honest and has a conscience, that they are paying their migrant workers the state minimum wage or whatever the legal minimum wage is.
Yeah, whatever that market rate is for that job in that market. Yeah.
Okay. Man, we this is work. This is. I've already learned like so much just in the however long this has been. We've been at this for shit. We're already going over half an hour. But anyway, Okay, so that covers our undocumented visa workers versus illegals. Tell me a little bit about asylum seekers and DACA recipients.
So DACA recipients, there is a particular program that President Obama started. It's full title, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, and that is specifically for individuals who arrived to the United States under the age of 16. I think it was before June 15th, 2012. I can't,
Close enough.
Yeah. And if they were out of status or never had any status, that they could apply for deferred action. Deferred action here in the immigration context is essentially the government saying I'm going to use the term to defer any action we're going to take against you. So we're not going to pursue removal or deportation while you have deferred action. We're not going to detain you while you have deferred action. You're going to be able to live here. They can apply for a work permit, but they have to fit within those particular timeframes, both age and arrival dates. They also have to have graduated from high school or gotten a GED. And there's pretty strict requirements around crimes as well. So they can't have committed 2 or more misdemeanors, which depending on the state could be something as minor as driving without a license. Some states that's a misdemeanor, or one serious misdemeanor or felony. And so that makes people ineligible for DACA, but it is a 2 years at a time, renewing status. The first Trump administration, he attempted to end DACA. At this point, they're no longer accepting new applications. It's only renewals.
What does it stand for again?
Deferred action for childhood arrivals.
Okay.
And then if I can just jump ahead real quick, with the other term, unless you have questions about that.
No.
There's the asylum seeker, which is someone who is in the active process of having applied for asylum, and so just quick definition, asylum is a humanitarian protection that we have in the United States for someone who either was persecuted in the past or has a well-founded fear of future persecution on the basis of race, religion, national origin, membership in a social group, or political opinion. And so if someone has a fear of returning to their home country, then they can apply for asylum. They're an asylum seeker while that case is processing. If they win their asylum case, they're an asylee. That is the status that they would get, which is a direct path to residency and then citizenship. Yeah.
Do they have to prove that somehow?
Yes. So, it is possible to win an asylum case purely based off of the testimony of the applicant, but there's also a requirement to provide any reasonably available corroborative evidence. So if you say that some protest happened and there was a police crackdown in your home country, and there was news stories written about it, if you don't provide those news stories, that's a big credibility issue. There's a lack of the adjudicators less likely to believe you in that case. And so it's testimony from yourself, from other witnesses, news stories, country conditions reports. The United States releases every year human rights reports and religious rights reports for pretty much every country. That kind of is a broad overview, but they're looking for specific instances or specific proof to that person or to similarly situated people. One thing I do like to be really clear about is I mentioned those 5 categories: race, religion, national origin, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. You could have been seriously harmed in your home country or fear serious harm or even death in your home country. But if it's not based or because of one of those 5 reasons, you will not win asylum. So it could be random violence. It could be you'll notice that I didn't, a lot of times if you ask people, hey, what are the bases for asylum? They might say gender or sexual orientation, which it's possible in some cases to fit that within the social group, category, but not every country will allow for that. It just depends on the factors there. I'll, if you have questions, please, but I just want to really quick, refugees. It's the same definition. It's the race, it's those 5 categories. It's persecution, having left their home country. The distinction is where the processing happens. So asylees, they're here in the United States and applying for asylum. If someone is a refugee, that means they were in a third country, processed by the UN and then by the U.S. Department of State and Homeland Security. And then when they arrive here, they have refugee status, which again is
So they got that status prior to departure, and
they're arriving and they're admitted as a refugee.
I got you.
Yeah.
Okay. So we kind of already talked about why the term illegal immigrant is controversial and why some people avoid using it. And I think I definitely see the difference there. A lot of the terminology really helps a great deal. So for someone unfamiliar with the process, what are the main legal pathways for immigrating to the U.S.? Because you mentioned earlier that they're here, but they have no path to citizenship. What differentiates path to citizenship versus you're here?
Yeah. So, I mean, primarily there's 4 main pathways. They'll go very broad at first. There's family-based immigration, which is our biggest form of immigration. There's employment-based immigration. There's humanitarian forms of immigration, which includes asylum and refugees and the victims of crime and labor trafficking. And then there's the diversity visa or the visa lottery. And so with that, when I say someone has no path to citizenship, it means either that they have no family who could petition for them, or they've otherwise lived a pretty fine life and haven't been the victim of a crime, which is good. We don't want people to be victims of crime, but it doesn't allow for them to access those certain pathways. And then, like I said, employment's murky, but usually it requires some special, in terms of coming here with an immigrant visa, so a pathway to residency and citizenship, not one of those repeating temporary visas, usually requires some specialized education or experience and someone who is willing to petition for you. And then the diversity visa is open to anyone who, has graduated high school or has, relevant work experience. When I say
high school in the United States,
high school anywhere, like a high school level education. Okay. But there's, my understanding is there's about, off the top of my head, about 80,000 of those visas available per year, and tens of millions of people apply per year. So it truly acts as a lottery.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that. How does the lottery work?
So it's free to throw your hat in the ring. You'd be like, hey, I facially qualify for this. The education piece, the not being a criminal in your home country, those sorts of things. And then the federal government just randomly picks those tens of thousands of people and say, congratulations, you can come to the United States.
So it's random. There's not like a hierarchy. We pick this guy because he's got a higher level of education than that guy.
Correct. It is blind in that way. Now, there's certain countries that have higher levels of immigration, and it kind of adjusts every year. Some of them are perennially on that list that aren't allowed to access the diversity visa because it's trying to have it be open to broad groups of people. So if you have a high number of people, immigrating from Great Britain, then the next year they might say no one from Great Britain is eligible for the diversity visa.
I see. Okay. So we hear a lot about people that should just get in line. Can you explain why it's just not that simple?
Yeah. So for the vast majority of people in this world, there is no line to get into. Like I said, you have to have a family member, have some incredibly specialized skill or education, or be really lucky with the diversity visa, or be really unlucky here in the United States and be the victim of a serious crime, But the vast majority of people will never qualify. So, for instance, when I talk about family-based immigration, there's only certain relatives that you can petition for. So as a U.S. citizen, I can petition for siblings, parents, children, and spouses. And that's where it ends. For permanent residents, so people who have green card but they're not citizens yet, they can only petition for spouse and children. And so when I say they can petition, that doesn't mean it's a quick process. It doesn't mean it's an easy process. So if I'm a U.S. citizen petitioning for a spouse, that's an immediate relative. According to immigration law, there's no visa cap. there are caps on every category that a permanent resident could apply for, and then also siblings of U.S. citizens and U.S. citizens applying for their adult or married children. So, as an example, if I'm a U.S. citizen and I'm applying for my sister who's overseas, right now the Department of State is processing applications that generally were filed in 2004. If my sibling was a citizen of Mexico, they're filing applications that were filed in 2001. So as of right now, that is 24 years in the past, but that does not mean that they would be eligible to process in 24 years because we've exceeded the visa allotment, the numbers of visas available for siblings of U.S. citizens every year, except maybe 2020 during that time frame. And the best guess is that it's likely a few to several decades to be able to process. So even if someone has a U.S. citizen sibling, submitting an application now, if you're not young, very young, it is likely that you will never live to see that visa become available.
Wow.
The backlogs exist for adult children, and sometimes it's incredibly difficult. So, for instance, I actually am working with a family right now where when they came as refugees, their oldest child had just aged out because he was over the age of 21. He wasn't able to travel with the family, so he's been overseas this whole time. They arrived in 2016 as refugees from Syria. They applied for him to come. They submitted an application. They were separated at some point, but they applied for him to come, and that process started. But of course, 2016, beginning of the Trump administration, who greatly reduced refugee admissions, and so the processing for those cases is incredibly long. At this point, it's 9 years later. The case was ready to process. He's in Germany now, but he was ready to process for a visa to come to the United States. But we just got an email from the embassy saying we are no longer processing this case because of the recent executive orders specifically around ceasing refugee admissions in the United States. And so even a situation where we're trying to incentivize or we're trying to make a mechanism for families to be reunited, I mean, refugees who are heavily vetted and incredibly humanitarian. It's an incredible humanitarian form of immigration. And at this point, this family is looking at 13 plus years of having to wait to be reunited with their child who, just separated from them at just the wrong time to,
Wow.
Yeah. And we see things like that regularly. Our conception of immediate relative or, family members that is oftentimes also much narrower in the United States where, you can't petition for an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent. Like that just we don't allow for that in our normal forms of immigration. And it can be very difficult to be separated from family for that long and sometimes indefinitely.
Yeah. So what about the undocumented people that get caught?
Yeah. So, we're hearing a lot recently about increased immigration enforcement. And so I'd say that's something that is causing a lot of fear in the immigrant population right now is being arrested, being detained by ICE or CBP, Immigration Customs Enforcement or Customs and Border Protection. And so really, it depends, and that's an answer. I'm surprised I haven't said it depends more often, but so if someone is contacted by immigration, if they maybe in their car crash or immigration stops them for whatever reason and tries to figure out, do you have permission to be here? And they don't. There's kind of two things that could happen at that point. One, they could be, there's three things. They could essentially be, they quickly get their fingerprints, kind of process them and say, hey, come to our field office, in 2 months, we want to check in with you, see what's going on. You could be detained for a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, or you could be detained kind of indefinitely while your case is processing. Essentially, once you have contacted immigration in that way, you are almost certainly going to be in immigration court, which means that the government is on the pathway to saying, you do not have permission to be here. We are trying to remove you, deport you from the United States. And there's things you can apply for. You can apply for asylum or other protections, but essentially you are then applying for those in defense of your removal from the United States.
And so you mentioned like the periods of being detained. Is that kind of dependent on the circumstances that they were contacted by immigration? Like, somebody who, maybe they got a speeding ticket or ran a stop sign. I mean, that's pretty low level stuff.
Yeah.
But somebody who's involved in with a crime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if someone has criminal history or prior immigration violations, or they view them as a flight risk, they're much more likely to be detained or having a bond placed. Some people are detained and they're released, quote, on their own recognizance, which is just without a bond, and they have regular check-ins either in person or like with an app. But some criminal history means that people are under mandatory detention. So ICE has no discretion, but pretty much everyone else, they can choose whether or not they want to detain someone. Immigration detention is very difficult. One, the rates of approval rates for people in detention or not in detention vary wildly, because the closest immigration detention center to Spokane on the far eastern side of Washington state is Tacoma on the far western side of Washington state. So even if you are put in the immigration detention center closest to you, which is not a guarantee, you are still about 5.5 hours away from your family, potentially from an attorney that your family can talk to. And it makes it very difficult to pursue a case in that way. Just there's a lot of barriers there. Additionally, if someone does have criminal history, ICE will defer to that criminal justice processing. So if someone's going to spend time in our jails here in Spokane County, that's going to take precedence. And so then by the time someone is detained, even if they have criminal history, they will have been released in a time at least in which we have determined as a society that they have like served their time. And so it's not to say that they might not have done something bad in the past, but immigration detention isn't necessarily saying they were loose and, they needed to be caught. It was more they were in jail, they served their sentence, and then after they're released, they're detained again for immigration processing.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's kind of a segue into the next topic. The feasibility of mass deportations.
Yeah.
Politicians have proposed mass deportations as a solution. What would implementing something like that actually look like in practice? I mean, we're hearing a lot about it lately.
So let's just say, there's 13 plus million undocumented individuals. So people who don't have permanent status, who are immigrants, but they're not stable here, for whatever reason. That's a sizable percentage of the United States. And a lot of those individuals are in mixed status families. And when I say that, I think people could probably make this conclusion, but it is that someone has status, whether it's permanent resident or citizen, oftentimes children, maybe a spouse, and then there's someone else in the family who has no status. So there's a couple things. One, that number is a large number. The level of mobilization and honestly just disruption to life would be massive. So this would be, increased law enforcement presence. I think unlike anything we've seen in a long time, maybe ultimately close to probably to how police have responded to, riots or major protests in the past, but kind of just in our normal everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
We also want to consider the impact that it has on the economy. The level of the percentage of immigrants, specifically in Washington state, that are farm workers, that are agricultural workers, is large. And to think that wouldn't have some impact on production, let alone like price and availability of produce, and also the percentage of immigrants in caretaking, as certified nursing assistants, is much higher than their percentage in the population as a whole. And so there's these critical industries that would be impacted. And even if you were to believe that could be filled back in, there would be some period of time with major disruptions, which would cause harm. And that is unavoidable. What you can argue whether or not that's a cost worth paying, but it is a cost that we are going to pay if that were to happen. And that's apart from just the actual cost,
the actual cost of getting all of those people mobilized to.
Yeah. Because that's immigration officials that need to work overtime, and that need more immigration officials that need to be hired. We currently have a backlog in our immigration court system. That means that the average case takes about 4.5 years. If you add millions of people into that, that's an even longer backlog. More judges need to be hired. The American Immigration Council is they recently put out a study for like what would mass deportation cost, and they kind of said pure dollar amount of just effectuating it. So this isn't knock-on impacts. Is about
the front side.
It's just the front side is about $80 billion a year. And so it's one of those things where I also just question, is that something that, the American people want to pay? And I hope that they don't. But it is something that would be disruptive on a scale that I don't think we're really used to seeing, at least for generations.
So we're looking at 80 bill.
80 billion with a B.
With a B on the front side.
Mm-hmm.
What about the entire impact?
Yeah. And, mentioning the farm workers, the caretakers, I also think it is harder to quantify monetarily. But again, we talked about these mixed status families. That is going to be, millions of children without one or both of their parents potentially, and that's we know that just from history that has negative impacts on their like attainment in life, but also just the trauma that would cause, especially, I mean, President Trump just recently revoked the safe spaces specifically for churches, schools, and hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
And those are three spaces that have been either literally sacred spaces or treated as such because they serve very critical roles in our society: education, healthcare, worship. Like those are things that, as a society, everyone's like, dude, those are good things. But they have now added so much more fear and anxiety that even if a child who maybe is undocumented or has parents who are undocumented never actually faces that, they go to school every day wondering, am I going to get contacted, or are my parents going to be picked up and I'm not going to be able to, I'm going to come home to no one being there. And that has less, again, harder to quantify, but still a really real impact.
Yeah. And this isn't, and the way you're saying this, I mean, this isn't just opinion.
Mm-hmm.
This is, it's fact.
Yeah.
So the next question I had for you, have mass deportations been attempted in the U.S. prior to the proposed attempt that's under the current administration? And if so, what lessons did we learn or not learn from those efforts?
Yeah, I mean, they have, and I'll be very upfront. I'm not as much of an immigration historian, but I mean, in the mid 1900s, especially, we had kind of later, mid to late 1900s, we had, a pushback, especially on a lot of Mexican farm workers. And there was large efforts to try to, remove them from the United States due to mass deportation. And I don't think we learned these lessons because in the same way, one, it was ineffective, it did not happen to the extent that they wanted it to, again, the number of people that we're trying to remove from the United States is an astronomical number, and is just near impossible to actually truly effectuate, but also the impacts it had on farm workers and the increased cost and the lack of supply that occurred because of that was very real and something that I think that we would see again.
Well, moving on.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, and this isn't quite mass deportation, but I will say, I mean, we have a history in the United States of having particularly disfavored groups of immigrants. Whether it be in the early 1900s, late 1800s, where those were, that included, Irish Catholics and, Italian Catholics, but also, the basis for a lot of our modern immigration law rests in the Chinese Exclusion Act and in the Supreme Court cases that kind of came out of that gave the executive really broad authority to try to do things like this. And I mean, as you could probably guess from the name, I mean, the law was very much directed at a certain group of people, at Asian immigrants. And if you look at the legislative history, even just the general cultural attitudes at the time, really focused on racial animus. We're willing to let them build our, transcontinental railroad, but didn't want to actually let them be full participants in our society. And so while not mass deportation, we do have the history of disfavored groups with immigration that I think ultimately do not serve our country. If we say, hey, we have a bunch of Chinese or, Pan-Asian immigrants who are working in California or working on the railroads, we want you to be full members of society. We would be better off than if we're trying to create an underclass of people, which ultimately an action like mass deportation just serves to push more people underground and make them more vulnerable for, being taken advantage of and being put in really dangerous or difficult situations.
right now it seems like we're under the notion that the purpose behind the mass deportation is because there's such a high percentage of immigrants, undocumented or otherwise, that are over here committing crimes. Do you happen to know what the actual statistics are on that? Because I've heard some of what I've heard. It seems like it kind of defies common sense, because if somebody's over here doing whatever it is that they're doing, it does not pay to come over here and commit crimes. You attract immigration, and that leads to your deportation.
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, but I do know, over time, consistently, studies have shown that immigrants are more entrepreneurial than U.S.-born citizens. They start businesses at a higher rate. They commit crimes at lower rates than U.S.-born citizens. And so that's not to say that there aren't immigrants who do commit crimes. I work with plenty of people who are survivors of violence that are committed by other immigrants, but that is not something that I want, use as a tool to paint all immigrants as criminals in a way to disadvantage them. I just, again, not wanting to jump to, economic arguments necessarily, because I have more of that humanitarian, that viewpoint. But it is a economic positive for the United States, like starting businesses. That's good. We all value that. Over the long run, especially, immigrants pay more into taxes than they receive in benefits. And so, the painting with a broad brush just serves to cover up the reality that immigration kind of in all ways, at least to the level it is right now, is a net positive for the United States.
Well, how about here's another broad brush. The notion that the entire world is emptying their prisons and asylums and sending all of those people over here. I would like your honest opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not true. I guess, so the people who approach the southern border and they want to claim asylum in those situations, or even if they don't, but a lot of times those people, even if they don't cross at a port of entry, where there's border guards, they will cross the river, they'll cross through the desert, and they will seek out border protection. And they will say, like, we're here, like, we want to do this. Now, there's plenty of people who try to evade that, yes. But the people who contact with immigration at any time, they get their biometrics taken. They get their fingerprints taken, the photo taken. If you're processing through immigration at all, they're doing a background check, a thorough background check on you, where, when there are situations where someone maybe is a notorious criminal, to the extent that happens, that is a situation in which, they would be detained, and they would be prevented from kind of being out and about in that situation. But there's just nothing to show that other countries are doing that. There's no, especially as a concerted effort, as a plan to try to destabilize the United States, that just doesn't happen and would be incredibly, also just like inefficient. I think, especially, this is a little bit off that question, but oftentimes some people point to drug smuggling, bringing drugs into the United States, and that undoubtedly does happen. And oftentimes, the border protection, they make, or border patrol, they make a big deal out of busts of people crossing through the desert, which is good. We don't want drugs coming into the United States. But the vast majority of drugs that are smuggled into the United States are through ports of entry by permanent residents or U.S. citizens, who are bringing them in here. And so you have to question, kind of our role in that perception. I think with things like that, we can't deny our role as a country in, we talk about, again, with the drug smuggling, that demand is coming from us. We have a problem in the United States with drug use and drug abuse that is incentivizing production, which then also causes violence that follows with that. Additionally, where do a lot of the weapons come from? They come from the United States. And so there is this destabilizing factor or influence that we do have when it comes to things like that. And so it's not to say that we're entirely to blame, but I think when we're talking about crime and violence, and especially when we're talking about cartels, where we cannot be blameless as a country in the entire situation. And yeah.
So does the term parolee add confusion to the fallacy that the world is dumping all their criminals and all the people that are tossed out of the asylums.
Yeah, I definitely think that adds to it. Whether or not every person is confused by that, I think that it doesn't help. Parole and immigration is divorced from the criminal justice context. It is a temporary permission to enter the United States, and it is something that has been used a lot in the last few years. The Trump administration disfavors, but when we think about the Afghans who were evacuated from Kabul in August of 21, pretty much all of them were brought into the United States under this parole. And now a lot of them, I've worked with a lot of them that came to Spokane. We applied for asylum, and won asylum, or we applied for it through family. And same thing, there's a program called Uniting for Ukraine, which is because of the war in Ukraine. And that is a parole program to allow for temporary entry to the United States. And additionally, a program that was for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And so it's been used a lot recently. And so more people are hearing the term parole. And I have to imagine that there's at least some level of people that hear that and they think criminal justice, they think release from prison and not temporary permission to enter the United States.
Because the first time I heard it, I didn't know what it meant.
Yeah.
And I could have been convinced that it meant the other.
Yeah. And I kind of, it's one of those things like I talk about all these things. It is from a perspective of understanding that it's kind of like, why would you, and it's, I don't expect people to, unless they then have very strong opinions about immigration. And then I'm like, okay, do the work to figure these things out. But people who approach this, like you have in our experiment, in our conversations together, with a curiosity, there's much more of a understanding and a patience for, you don't know, why would you? It's my job to know. It's your job to record this podcast and be a firefighter. Yeah.
Well, because it's just such a huge issue. And it's like, I really want to understand it because I hear the arguments on both sides. I want to be able to weed out the bullshit.
Yeah.
And it's troubling because as you mentioned earlier, I mean, we are a very strong global presence, probably the strongest global presence. And with that comes responsibility because it shouldn't be a surprise that so many people come here seeking a new life or seeking safety or seeking, safe harbor from wherever they came from.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many reasons why people would. I mean, Afghanistan looms large in my mind just because of my experience of working with a lot of Afghans that were brought to the United States. But there's this perspective of we spent over 2 decades in Afghanistan, and anyone who was affiliated with the United States or the Western world generally is in danger there. The Taliban does not look kindly upon that. There's a lot of expert opinions out there on that. And we, like I said, we had a lot of people come here on parole, which is a great first step. It's a quick, fast acting way to get them here. But then to not create an additional pathway, where, we have something called the Cuban Adjustment Act, which was a foreign policy consideration to have an easier pathway for Cubans to get residency in the United States. It made sense at the time when it was started. And there's a lot of immigration advocates who are pushing for the Afghan Adjustment Act. We wanted, they were here. We brought them here, and our involvement in their country, however it started, but our involvement in their country puts them at very real risk. And it is this level of responsibility that we should have as a country to, take care of our messes, for lack of a better phrase.
Understood. So what about the children that are born here? The birthright citizenship and deportation of U.S. born children. So as long getting lumped into the mass deportations are children that were born here. And as I understand it, the 14th Amendment guarantees birthright citizenship. How does that protection affect children born in the U.S. to undocumented parents?
Yeah. So, President Trump, he issued an executive order that was essentially anti-birthright citizenship. Like you said, it's in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. It is a guaranteed right. And there was a judge out of Western Washington that put a pause on that executive order while it was, being decided ultimately, which I think is the right the right decision. I mean, from my perspective decision, but also from a legal analysis. When the 14th Amendment was adopted, there's legislative history. There's that we have recorded that we show that they were considering a lot of different perspectives in terms of like who could be considered a citizen based off of birth, and the carve-outs that they had were people who are not subject to the jurisdiction of the laws of the United States, which generally at this point is construed to be like diplomats, people who are here who have diplomatic immunity and invading armies, and I know that President Trump uses a lot of the rhetoric of an invasion when it comes to undocumented immigrants. I think it's kind of it begs. It's hard for me to accept that framing, of an invasion, especially because we've talked as an invading army. So when we talk about the deportation of U.S. citizen children, that is not so. I mean, and U.S. citizens have been deported in the past, and that's because there are documentation issues. It's hard to prove it, and the system, there's not enough due process to protect those situations. But in this case, when we're talking about the deportation of U.S. citizen children, it's more likely to be a functional deportation and not like an actual legal one, where if their parents, maybe both their parents are undocumented and they're deported back to their country of birth, what are their parents going to do? Almost certainly they're going to make the determination that it's better for their family to stay together and have the children go with them. But that isn't not because they are required to leave. If there was a guardian or a third party who could care for that child, they would have the legal right to be here in the United States. And then the birthright citizenship question, I mean, that's just as much of a U.S. citizen. I mean, same thing with the people who naturalize are just as much of a U.S. citizen as people who have family that stretch back to the founding of the country. One piece that's a little bit, because a lot of times when people talk about birthright citizenship, they say, well, we're all immigrants, of course, except for the tribes. But the thing that is, I want to highlight, because I think it's important for us to continue to protect this, is one of the carve-outs to birthright citizenship from the 14th Amendment is Native Americans. So they actually did not obtain birthright citizenship until later in the 1900s, where there was actually an act passed by Congress that provided Native Americans birthright citizenship. And so it is one of those things that at the time when the 14th Amendment was adopted, they all understood it to be like not counting the tribes, not counting Native Americans. And it wasn't until later when they said, actually, we're creating a law that says, yes, they will get birthright citizenship. And so that is something that could be changed by an act of Congress.
Well,
everything else with birthright citizenship,
where would they go?
Well, I mean, and that's it would be serving to create an underclass. It'd be people who don't have the same level of protection. And so, yeah. But everything else, birthright citizenship. We're talking about undocumented individuals have kids. That would require a change to the Constitution, an amendment that would be a lengthy process and one that would be fought vociferously by many people, including myself.
Understood. And that was my next question, is like, what would it take to do that? And I can't imagine that's not just done with an executive, within an executive order.
And I just want to, and I apologize, I want to take a moment, just the thought of birthright citizenship is relatively unique in the world. There's not that many countries that have birthright citizenship, but I think it's something that the United States should be proud of. It's the idea that anyone, regardless of where their parents came from or how long they've been in the United States, like, they belong here. Right. And we have benefited time and time again from people who don't have long histories here. Like, both sides of my family can trace back to before the American Revolution. I have no connection to any other country. But that does not make me any more of a United States citizen than someone who was born here 2 days ago and whose parents have no status. They have just as much of a right to take ownership of this country, and like in terms of the ideals of this country, and to be able to wave the flag and to be proud and to criticize and to do all the things that are the rights of U.S. citizens. And I'm particularly proud of that. And, like I said, we'll do everything I can to make sure that stays the same.
Good. When it comes to immigration reform, what are the biggest misconceptions that you see among politicians or in public debates?
I mean, a lot of it is rooted in the questions that we've been talking about so far, where especially like highlighting the question, like the conversation around, immigrants are criminals, or they, countries are sending the people from their asylums or from the jails. And there's a lot of discussion around that, which is, like I said, is it just not proven to be true with in a generalization, of course, again, with individuals that do fit that. I think, I'll be honest, when it comes to immigration reform, it's really hard for me not to be pessimistic. I feel like my whole life, working with my dad, growing up around the dinner table, hearing about talk about immigration reform.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, at least for many years, there was an understanding like these DACA recipients, they were in a difficult situation. They were brought here, no fault of their own. We should find a pathway to citizenship for them. And so, it's hard for me to be like, to think about immigration reform as something that is feasible. It doesn't mean I want to keep fighting for it, but it's just so hard to believe that it will actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, I think that a lot of national politicians, I believe that they understand, at least at a surface level, our immigration system.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they have incentives on both sides to play up, stereotypes of immigration or, to kind of be at a surface level. I think that the American people as a whole, like you said, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about our immigration system. Oftentimes when I'm talking to people who maybe are a little more anti-immigrant than I am, which is not hard, but they describe to me what they think the immigration system is. And I'm like, I wish that what you said was true. Our system is way more punitive, and way more difficult. There's so many more barriers to getting status and to like normalize, like to legalizing oneself. And I wish that wasn't the case. And I don't know how much this is answering your question, but I think it just goes to show my inner difficulty with believing in comprehensive immigration reform as a viable or likely process in the future.
So, like people say, "Oh, well, okay, you're so smart. What would you do to fix it?" So, if you had your choice, what reforms would you make?
Yeah. So one, I would get rid of those bars we talked about earlier, the unlawful presence bars, because we have a lot of people who are here right now who would be able to get their residency on a pathway to citizenship if they were able to leave the United States without punishment. And this means, and I work with people who were trying to go down that pathway and they've been here for decades often. They are here and they have their, like you said, they're building their life. They have the community, they're pillars, in the lives of the people around them. And so it's really wanting to make it so that those people can normalize their status and be able to be full participants in society, in a way that so far has been denied to them. I think also, this is a small thing, but there's something called green card through registry. And essentially it is just proving that you've been in the United States long enough. And you can just say, I would like a green card because of that. It used to be something that was generally considered a smart policy move by both sides. The last time that that registry date was moved up, was changed, was in the 90s. And so it used to be a trailing 20-year period. So I believe it's 1972 right now, that if you can prove you've been in the United States since 1972, you can just, assuming you're not criminally ineligible or things like that, you can just submit an application and get residency. I think that makes a lot of sense because because again, when that time was set, that was 20 years in the past. That would be like right now, if I said you've been here since 2005, you haven't committed crimes, you've just been a member of society. It doesn't make any sense to me to say you've been here for 20 years, you have to go. If you've been here, you've been a productive member of society, especially, you haven't made yourself ineligible through immigration violations. It just makes sense to say, come on in, allow yourself to be able to vote and to be able to participate in potentially like your child's schooling without fear of immigration enforcement, to be able to volunteer and do those things. I would also, I'll let you speak. Yeah.
Well, yeah. The only thing I was going to add to that is, since I was a kid, I've been hearing people talking about, hey man, show me your green card. I just now know what that means. God. So in the last election and the one before that, the border has been considered to be, one of the pinnacle issues, if not the pinnacle issue to the current, the election
of the current administration.
Yeah.
How do we strike a balance between border security and protecting human rights? What's the reality behind the situation at the border?
Yeah, I think I'll let you know is what I will say is we have not figured that out, what that balance is. And this is not just President Trump. This is, President Obama separated families. That happened, and deported millions of people. And Biden did the same thing. I think a lot of times the difference around the border is the communication. There's some people right now, even though it's been a week and change of President Trump in his second term, he's been advertising deportation flights. And so people now are more scared, even though a similar level happened in Biden, So I think a part of it is a framing, but I also want to make it clear that this is across parties. We have not figured out what is this balance. I think, again, it is a fundamental multi-decade failure to invest in infrastructure. And so, security, sure, that makes sense. We want to know who's coming in, but ultimately we don't have the facilities to deal with, families and children at the border. We haven't invested in asylum officers who can do prompt screenings of people to say, yes, you are credible. We believe you. And we want to, fast track you to residency because of that. Instead, we're going to put you in this backlog that is several years long, makes it really hard for you to remember and provide evidence in these cases. And so I think it would be, right now there's a large investment, that is being proposed for the border. It is more on hardening the border. I want to be really clear when it comes to hardening the border. And when I say that, I mean make it harder to access the United States and the protections that we provide. There is a 1-to-1. You make it harder to access the United States, more people will die. And I mean that like they will across the border and through the desert, they will pay coyotes or the cartels to get them in the United States, which is incredibly dangerous. And the more difficult we make it, human rights abuses happen. And that is a fact that is demonstrated that the more barriers we put in, this happens. For instance, President Trump is restarting the Remain in Mexico policy, what he calls the migrant protection protocols, which I think is a farce of a name, because the last time he implemented this in his administration, which Biden kept a good bit into his administration as well, there was many documented instances of, which again is saying people come to the border, they want asylum. We say, great, you're going to remain in Mexico while you're waiting for your court hearing. These are people who don't have the ability to work in Mexico, don't have a place to stay. There's so many documented instances of sexual assault, of cartels trafficking people, that is an extreme net negative just for like human flourishing and human good. And so I think it just requires so much more of an investment in facilities that aren't just like jails. I think our jails should be better environments for people generally too, but that's outside of this conversation. But right now, if someone is being detained at the border, even if they are 100% deserving of asylum according to our law, they're being held in facilities that are, uncomfortable, oftentimes forcing families, mothers, fathers, children to be separated. And we need to be investing in ways that allow them to be comfortable, to be able to present their story, and to have those cases, especially those cases that are like clearly facially deserving of asylum or protection, to be processed quickly so they can have security in the United States.
So this was sort of the picture in my mind. So you're talking about, the facilities and the infrastructure that needs to be in place to accommodate the people trying to come in. I also had kind of an image in my head of what it could potentially look like in the people that we're trying to kick out. Because if we've got that problem coming in, I can't imagine if we think we're going to deport 13 million people, what's that going to look like? I mean, are we, in my head, I picture these giant camps that you can't not compare them to concentration camps.
Or Japanese internment. An example from our history. And they're with immigration court generally. I mean, I have a lot of, due process concerns just with how difficult it is. There's not a right to counsel in immigration court, even though the consequences are very serious. You can, if you can afford an attorney or find one, they can be with you, but the government's not going to provide one. There's also something called expedited removal, which President Trump is trying to expand the use of. And if you can't prove that you've been in the United States for 2 years, that you could essentially be deported in a day. And even if that's happening and you express a fear of return, you're supposed to get what's called a credible fear interview. And they decide, do we believe you? Do we think that you could potentially get asylum? But at the same time, the due process in expedited removal is so minimal. And like you said, adding millions of people into that system, it is rife for mistakes, whether or not it's a bad actor and someone who like has animus against immigrants, or just someone who is overworked and overwhelmed by these issues. Like, mistakes are going to happen, and those mistakes oftentimes have very serious consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. Now, I know, I mean, you've been involved in hundreds of cases. Can you share one of the memorable ones?
Yeah. This is from a while ago, but so Spokane, I'm really proud, has a really good history of refugee resettlement here. We currently have 2 resettlement agencies, World Relief and IRC, the International Rescue Committee, and they bring a lot of refugees into Spokane, and they do a pretty good job of getting them settled and set up to succeed. I don't work for a refugee resettlement agency, so I tend to see them later on once they're applying for their green card or for citizenship. And I remember specifically applying for citizenship for someone. They'd been here for 5 years. We're submitting the application for them to become a U.S. citizen. We go to their interview. They have no criminal history. They have no immigration violations. It's a really straightforward process. Honestly, I would have forgotten about it years ago if it wasn't for the fact that after the interview, they were talking, we're walking, outside of the building, and they say, I grew up in a country that did not want me, that forced me out. And like, I was in this third country. They were in a refugee camp for like 15 years. And they're like, in this other country, they didn't give me permission to work. They didn't want me either. And finally, like, I come to the United States, and it's like, now 5 years later, I can say like, this country wants me. Like this is my home. And that's someone who, for the vast majority of their life, did not feel any level of certainty or any amount of acceptance. And I think that is incredibly unique in the United States. And I think that's something that like I want to fight for, that I'm so proud of, to have someone who had a lot of difficulties even when they were here, trying to learn English, find a job, better themselves. But it's still, once they get to that point in their life, are able to say like, this place, this country wants me and I feel at home. That is one of the most humbling moments. Like, in this conversation, you've heard me either hint at or straight up complain about the United States. I think that there's a lot of things, and I am really proud of the fact that I can do that. I don't have to worry about police knocking down my door because I said something bad about the government. But I also just can't lose sight of the fact that sometimes the most grateful and the most like true Americans are some of the most recent Americans. And I'm consistently humbled by that.
And I've seen that, just in my adventures out in the streets. And that does remind me of a question that I wish that I'd asked you earlier. And it kind of goes back to some of the misconceptions. And, in the last election, I heard stories like, oh, they're just trying to, the Democrats are trying to get all these. And I'm not saying this because I'm politically leaning one way or the other. It's just that that's a story that the Democrats are trying to get all these illegals over here so that they can get them into the voting booths.
Yeah.
Bullshit or not bullshit?
That's bullshit. Yeah. No, first of all, I mean, you can't vote until you're a U.S. citizen. And so that's a very long-term strategy, which still has, as shown by the most recent election, has not paid off in the way that you hope it would. But also, a lot of immigrants are, by culture or inclination or past experience, are conservative. If I think specifically with the Hispanic populations, a lot of the immigrants who are here, Cubans, Venezuelans especially, they came to the United States because they were fleeing left-wing authoritarian regimes. Now, I do not think that the regimes of Cuba and Venezuela are in any way truly comparable to the Democratic Party, but they have a natural inclination to vote for and support more conservative parties. And I see a lot of immigrants who are, supportive of the Republican Party. I think that if that is truly a concern, if someone's like, hey, I think that you're trying to bring people in who are going to support you, I think the proper response to that would be, we'll then make policies that are more appealing to people. But I think in reality, there's not a one single, hey, the immigrants are going to vote for Democrats. That just doesn't bear out in reality.
Okay. That puts that to rest. And then there's also, the stories about entitlements. Oh, they're coming over here and they're cashing in on Social Security and they're getting driver's licenses and they're getting Social Security cards and they're getting this and they're getting that. What are they getting? What are they not getting? What's bullshit and what's not bullshit?
Yeah. So you mentioned driver's license. In Washington State, I am really grateful for, is a state that does allow people to get driver's licenses regardless of status, which I think is just a good policy decision. We want to know who's on the road and we want to know who's in the state doing what they're doing. And so I think that is just good policy. When it comes to benefits, by and large, undocumented immigrants are not eligible for the vast majority of benefits, especially no federally available benefits. So we're talking about like Medicaid, Apple Health. Now, Washington State has expanded that a little bit, especially for youth and also pregnant women, which to me makes sense, but a lot of them are just not eligible for a lot of benefits. I work with people who are undocumented, have been here for decades, and they come to me when they're in their 50s and 60s and say, I want to start thinking about getting my Social Security. They've been working for decades in the United States, but they have no status, and they're not going to be able to, unless something changes, which they don't have anything to change, right? They're not going to be able to withdraw anything from that. They've been paying into Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes, and they're not going to get that.
How do they end up? This is my ignorance. How do they pay in?
So it's either using a fake Social Security or one that they got from somewhere. But there's also there's something called an ITIN, which is an individual tax identification number, which serves as a Social Security for a lot of purposes. And for instance, a lot of people who are contractors or start their own business, they get an ITIN so that they have their own thing that then allows them to open their business. But again, unless there's something that happens that gives them status that allows them to then be eligible to receive those benefits, they're not going to be able to benefit from what they were paying.
So they receive the benefits of being able to be recognized as workers in their taxes, pay taxes and into Social Security.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, there's more people that are not getting Social Security and are paying into it than there are people getting Social Security that did not pay into it.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no federal benefits.
Again, and this is at that point, the benefits that are available to people become state by state. So Washington is much more welcoming and more generous than a lot of other states. I think it's done for policy reasons. We want to make sure that children aren't food insecure, so regardless of status, children are more eligible to get food assistance, even if they're, lacking some forms of status or, like I said, getting Medicaid, where if children are going to be in the United States, if they're going to be engaging in life generally, we want to make sure that they're getting enough food and they're getting health care. And I think that, again, at least from my perspective, that's a good policy decision. We want to make sure that is, it's wanting to make sure we don't, continue to build up an underclass of people that are underserved and, potentially, going to be making worse decisions in their future because they've lived a deprived life in certain ways. So there are some benefits that people are eligible for. That's definitely true. But again, there are plenty of studies out there, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but that show that the again, taxes taken in versus benefits given out, that is a positive for the federal government. And the IRS, like I said, sometimes people use false documents, but the IRS doesn't care. They just want their money, and so they'll take it and they want people filing taxes. Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm out of questions.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have too.
I have learned so much, it's nice to know that I had some of it right.
Yeah.
But I feel like I've learned just a massive amount.
And like you were mentioning earlier, it's just such a deep topic where I've been practicing in immigration for several years. And like I said, I've walled off all of employment-based immigration. It's just there's too much to consider.
Sure.
That you really can spend a whole career and be learning new things all the time. Yeah.
I think it's you saying that you spent several years in immigration. I think that's kind of an understatement.
you grew up in it. I mean, you had a lifetime of immersion in it.
Yeah.
So I think you're a very credible individual to tap your knowledge,
which I do appreciate. And I'm grateful that I have been able to spend so far my career in Spokane and being able to like really dive deep into a community. And I mean, if you couldn't tell from my name and from how my whole look, like I said, I'm not an immigrant, and there's a level of buy-in that I need to like earn. And like, I get that. Like, I don't like, if I was an immigrant and there was just a random white guy coming up being like, I want to work with you and help you, like, I'd be skeptical, And so being in this community and being able to work with the, various community leaders and connect with the people at their places of worship, at restaurants, at community events has just truly been a privilege and an honor. And I've just been so grateful for how I have been able to connect and work with the community here.
Well, it's been a privilege and an honor to have you on the show and to be able to connect with you and discuss this. And I really appreciate you being here. And Sam, I thank you for your time.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that's our show for today. And I'd like to thank you for being here. Now, I try to practice a little bit of gratitude every day, and I'm grateful for my team. First, I'd like to thank my guests for allowing me into their homes and for putting up with the mess at my house. Next, I'd like to thank my main man, J-Mac, at Studio 42 for his audio prowess. A lot of guys want him to be in their gang because he's pretty good with the bow staff, but I appreciate him editing my material. And next, I'd like to thank Heather at Ravenous Raven Design for my kick-ass website. Have a great day, be excellent to each other, and party on.